Throughout the centuries, many men and women have ruled over kingdoms and countries. Some were known for their skill in leading their people. Others, like King Henry VIII, were known for their tyrannical behaviour and evil. But in the centuries after their deaths, there has been a significant amount of morbid curiosity about the bodies and remains of these royals. Some of them were given huge tombs to be buried and were embalmed after death in such a way that was aimed to preserve their remains until the end of time. But some of the coffins and tombs have been opened and the bodies of the former royals removed and desecrated in horrific ways. For example, Catherine of Valois' corpse was defiled for years, centuries after her death, and people even paid to kiss the rotting queen's remains, that of the Queen of King Henry V. One of King Henry VIII's wives, his final wife, even had her remains dug up, ripped from her grave, and strangely, people danced with her rotting body. In this documentary, we look at some of the worst royal afterlives and look at how and why people decided to disturb the deceased royals. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 30th of August 1548, Catherine Parr gave birth to a daughter and her first child at Sudley Castle. The child was named Mary, after Catherine's close friend and stepdaughter Mary, the later Queen Mary I of England. Together, Catherine and her fourth husband, Thomas Seymour, welcomed the healthy baby girl into their lives. Interestingly, although Catherine and Mary I were polar opposites in terms of religion, they were extremely close. It's sad to note that Elizabeth, later Elizabeth I, was not present for what came next. Although she resided at the castle with Catherine, the reason for her absence is rather unsettling. The feverish Catherine was overheard speaking to Thomas Seymour about a very serious matter. It's believed that Seymour had sexually harassed, if not actually molested, Elizabeth on multiple occasions. But unfortunately, Catherine sided with the man she desperately loved and with whose child she was heavily pregnant. Elizabeth was sent away from Sudley Castle in disgrace, as if Seymour's faults were her own. Now, it was only 6 months before Catherine and Thomas married that the King of England died. And as it so often did for women of the Tudor era, what began with joy and hope ended in a slow and painful death. Baby Mary Seymour was just 1 week old when Catherine died of presumed postnatal complications and sepsis. After her death, her daughter was placed into the household of her close friend, Catherine Willoughby, the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk. Now, after her death, Catherine lay in repose at Sudley, only for a short while before her body was wrapped in cere and then placed in a lead coffin. Into the soft lead was impressed, K.P. Hereth lieth Queen Catherine, wife to King Henry VIII, and the wife of Thomas Lord of Sudley, High Admy, and England, and uncle to King Edward VI. Lady Jane Grey was the chief mourner at the funeral, which is believed to be the first Protestant service of its kind in England, and afterwards the Queen was buried within the chapel, and it was here that she lay, untouched for over 200 years. But above the ground, the church and its estates were falling into ruin, and one man's morbid curiosity then disturbed the resting place of the once Queen Consort. In the summer of the year 1782, Mr. John Lucas, who had occupied the land of Lord Rivers, whereon the ruins of the chapel stood, had the curiosity to rip off the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the Queen, but to his great surprise found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cere cloths of linen, entire and uncorrupted, although it had lain there upwards of 230 years. His unwarrantable curiosity led him also to make an incision through the cerecloth, which covered one of the arms of the corpse, the flesh of which at the time was white and moist. I was very much displeased at the forwardness of Lucas, who had his own hand opened the coffin. It would have been quite sufficient to have found it and then have made a report of it to Lord Rivers or myself. This account continued. In the summer of the year following 1783, his lordship's business made it necessary for me and my son to be at Sudley Castle. and on being told what had been done the year before by Lucas, I directed the earth to the once more removed to satisfy my own curiosity, and I found Lucas's account of the coffin and corpse to be just as he had represented them, with the difference that the body was then grown quite fetid, and the flesh where the incision had been made was brown and in a state of putrefaction, in consequence of the air having been let upon it. The stench of the corpse made my son quite sick. Whilst he copied the inscription which is on the lead of the coffin, he went through it, however, with great exactness. I afterwards decided that a stone slab should be placed over the grave to prevent any further and improper inspection. It is believed that the hair clippings, a tooth and a swatch of fabric from the sleeve of Catherine's bridal dress were taken at this point. Sadly, this was not the last time that poor Catherine would be disturbed, as in 1792 Catherine's coffin was dug up by a group of drunks and then reburied upside down. It was 25 years until Lord Chandos, the owner of Sudley, decided to move Catherine to a safer tomb, and the exhumation was done by Reverend John Lates. Lates had completed repairs at the chapel, and on the 18th of July 1817 the following notes were made by Edmund T. Brown. After considerable search, the coffin was found bottom upwards in a walled grave where it had been deposited. It was then removed to the Chandos vault, and we proceeded to examine the body, but the coffin having been so frequently opened, we found nothing there but a bare skeleton, except a few pieces of cerecloth, which was still under the skull, and a dark-coloured mass which proved to contain, when washed, a small quantity of hair, which exactly corresponded with some I already had. The roots of the ivy, which you may remember grew in such profusion on the walls of the chapel, had penetrated into the coffin, and completely filled the greater part of it. We then had the different pieces of lead, which from time to time had been cut from the coffin, firmly nailed together so as to present the original form of the coffin, and it was placed on 2 large flat stones by the side of the former Lord Chandos. Dr. Nash said, the Queen must have been low of stature, as the lead was enclosed her corpse was but 5 feet 4 inches in length. You see, a height of around 5'4" was considered middling for a woman of the 1500s, and accords well with a woman who, when live, was neither described as tall or small. Brown concluded the ancient chapel, which had been desecrated by the Puritan, was thoroughly renovated under the direction of Sir John Gilbert Scott, and a handsome decorated altar tomb, surmounted by a Gothic canopy, was erected on the north side of the sacrarium to the memory of Queen Catherine Parr, whose effigy was rendered as correctly as it could be from the portraits which are extant. It was 216 years after her death that Catherine Parr, safely under her alabaster image, was finally able to enter into a restful eternity. Throughout the medieval period, there were a number of queens who served their kings and husbands well with good counsel and advice. However, there were some that were treated poorly in their death, and one example was Catherine of Valois. Following her death, she was left unburied for 400 years inside of Westminster Abbey, and people would flock to see and touch her remains, and some would even kiss the rotting remains of the former queen. But there was another medieval queen, whose remains inside of Westminster Abbey were defaced and even stolen. But her story is not the most well known. Anne of Bohemia was a queen who was married to King Richard II, and she was a princess who came to England to marry the king. However, at the age of 28, she tragically died from the plague, but what happened to her remains was disturbing and shocking. Anne of Bohemia was born on the 11th of May 1366, and she had 4 brothers, including Sigismund, who would go on to become the Holy Roman Emperor. She had a number of other half-siblings, and she was brought up at Prague Castle. She was left in the care of her brother, King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, But then when she was around the age of 16, she married Richard II of England. An agreement had been drawn up between the two nations, and the marriage went ahead. Anne's father was the most powerful European monarch at the time, and he ruled over half of Europe's population and lands. The marriage of Richard and Anne was contracted against the wishes of many of the nobility and members of Parliament, and Richard had been offered a number of other brides who would have brought in larger dowries. But Anne was chosen, and she brought with her no dowry, just a huge amount of European power through her father and family. Richard gave 20,000 florins, which would be around £4 million today, to her brother for the marriage, and together he and the king agreed the alliance to try and reunite Christendom. English merchants, because of the marriage, were now allowed to trade in Bohemian land and the lands of the Holy Roman Emperor, which were also a small positive. However, Richard's negotiating team with the marriage had been held ransom during their journey home, and the marriage treaty was signed in the May of 1381. But when Anne of Bohemia arrived in England, her arrival had been delayed due to storms, and many at the time criticised her. The Westminster Chronicler said Anne was a tiny scrap of humanity, and many predicted that things would go bad following the marriage. But Anne and King Richard II were married on the 20th of January 1382 inside of Westminster Abbey. Londoners were not happy, but despite this, there were a number of tournaments held in their honour. The King and Queen then toured England, and Anne would visit Norwich, where great gifts were given to her, including a huge ceiling painting depicting 252 black eagles in her honour. The King and Queen were just 15 when they met and married, but these teenagers fell head over heels in love with each other, and it was said over the years the King proved truly devoted to his new wife. She was a key advisor to her husband throughout their 12 years of marriage, and she was a very kind person who was popular with people over time. She became known for procuring pardons for those who participated in the Peasants' Revolt, one of the most dangerous threats to Richard II's reign and throne. She also managed to get a pardon for a man who had been indicted for murder for 14 years. She also intervened in saving the life of John Northampton, the former mayor of London. Richard II had sentenced him to death, but Anne's words switched his death sentence to life imprisonment. She was even involved in getting the City of London to reconcile with their king following the Peasants' Revolt. However, despite her growing popularity, Anne of Bohemia did not complete many of the expected duties of a queen during the medieval period. Despite 12 years of marriage, she would not produce an heir for Richard II. She was said to have been kind to pregnant women, however never had children herself. A chronicler wrote, "This queen, although she did not bear children, was still held to have contributed to the glory and wealth of the realm as far as she was able. Noble and common people suffered greatly after her death." She was known as Good Queen Anne, but as mentioned, she would die shockingly and early. On the 7th of June 1394, at Sheen Manor, at the age of 28, Anne of Bohemia died from the plague. This had caused chaos across London and large parts of England, and the Queen, despite trying to avoid the deadly disease, caught it and succumbed to it. This was a huge blow to her husband Richard, who was so upset and distraught that he demolished Sheen Manor, where she had died. Anne had managed throughout her time as Queen of England to calm her husband and offer him good counsel. However, after her death, Richard would go off the rails and would later lose the throne. He would even marry a 6-year-old girl later after her death, but this was not the end of Anne of Bohemia's story, and shockingly, in death, she was treated terribly. Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey, and following the death of her husband Richard II later, he would be buried with her.
In 1395, Richard sealed contracts for a monument for himself and Anne to be buried together. This was a first in England, as it was the first double tomb commissioned and ordered for the burial of an English king and queen. The base of the monument was made from Purbeck marble and was sealed with 2 London masons doing the work. And then, on top of the tomb, were 2 life-size effigies of Richard and Anne. The effigies were to be made from gilded copper and were to lie under a canopy. They were to be crowned, and their right hands were to be joined, and they were to be holding sceptres in their hands. When their tomb was finished, it would have been amazing. But over the years, a significant amount of vandalism took place on their tomb. Their effigies were decorated with patterns and platinate badges, and the initials R and A were intertwined in knots. Richard was depicted in his Parliament robes, and Anne's inscription says, "Beneath a broad stone now Anna lies entombed. When she lived in the world, she was the bride of Richard II. She was devoted to Christ and well known for her deeds. She was ever inclined to give her gifts to the poor. She calmed quarrels and relieved the pregnant. She was beauteous in body, and her face was gentle and pretty. She provided solace to widows and medicine to the sick. In 1394, on a pleasant 7th day of the month of June, she passed over. Amen." However, shockingly, Anne of Bohemia's tomb was broken into, and her tomb was desecrated. Over the centuries, the tomb was damaged by relic hunters and souvenir hunters who would chip away the parts of the hands of the king and queen, and also would chip away parts of their tomb, including the crowns. This left the tomb being badly damaged today, and there was also a significant amount of wear on the tomb. However, they haven't been looked after as well as they could have been. The horrific part of Anne's story is that, in 1871, her tomb was opened by a curious dean of the abbey, who had been given permission by Queen Victoria to carry out a survey of the royal burials inside the abbey. Dean Stanley would try to locate the remains as of many kings and queens as he could, and he would open up the vault and tomb containing the remains of Richard II and Anne of Bohemia. When the tomb was opened, it was found that most of Anne's skeleton was missing, as throughout the years visitors to the abbey had stolen them. There was found to have been a hole in the side of the tomb's base, where the enamelled shields had once been attached, and with this they had been stealing the bones and remains of a queen. Visitors had literally been reaching into Anne's tomb and rustling around and then stealing her bones and remains. This was incredibly shocking, and it means that still today there may be bones of the 14th century queen inside of people's collections in their homes. The Dean of Westminster would also then arrange the bones which had been disturbed to be moved to a much neater and better arranged pile, and with this he would also put some items back inside of the tomb which had been added there also after the burials took place. But this was a very sad end to Anne of Bohemia, as many of her bones and remains were taken and stolen from her tomb by people who visited Westminster Abbey. She was a queen who died tragically at a young age, and despite being Queen of England for 12 years, she had a lasting impact on the people. She turned public opinion, but in the centuries that came after, her tomb was vandalised and chipped away at, and someone even made a hole in the side of it and exploited this to steal her remains. She should have been laid to rest in relative peace and quiet inside the heart of English Christian religion, Westminster Abbey.
By the early 1600s, Elizabeth was an old woman by the standards of her time. She had been born in 1533 and was approaching her 70th year, an extraordinary age in the 16th century. For decades she had lived under the constant pressures of rule, political intrigues, religious struggles, and the burdens of never marrying or producing an heir. Her health had slowly begun to fail, and those close to her noticed that she was increasingly weary. Elizabeth's last years were also marked by grief. Many of the people who had surrounded her for most of her reign, trusted courtiers, friends and advisers, were dying off one by one. Most painfully was the death of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601. Essex had been a favourite of the Queen. Some said even a love interest, but after he led a failed rebellion, Elizabeth had no choice but to sign his death warrant. Watching him go to the executioner weighed heavily on her conscience. Those close to her remarked that she never fully recovered from that decision. By the winter of 1602 to 1603, Elizabeth's health was visibly deteriorating. She complained of aches and pains, and her appetite grew weaker. She had always taken great pride in her appearance, covering herself with elaborate gowns, jewellery, and the iconic white makeup that gave her face its ghostly glow. But now she could no longer disguise her frailty. Observers described her as thin and melancholy. Her teeth, once famously crooked, had decayed further, making speech more difficult. She became prone to long silences, staring off into the distance as if lost in thought. Her court physicians could do little. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, and treatments often involved bleeding or strange potions. None of this eased her decline. What seemed to have pushed Elizabeth more deeply into her final decline was sorrow. In the spring of 1603, another of her close companions, Lady Catherine Howard, died. This loss struck the Queen hard. She sank into depression, refusing to eat or sleep properly. She spent long hours sitting on the floor, refusing to go to bed. Eyewitnesses recorded that she sat motionless for hours, sometimes with her fingers pressed to her lips, her eyes staring into the shadows. Courtiers begged her to lie down, but she resisted, saying that if she lay down she would never rise again. It was as if Elizabeth, who had always been strong-willed, was preparing herself for the end. By March of 1603, Elizabeth had stopped eating almost entirely. She was growing weaker, but her mind remained sharp. She was aware of her condition and knew that death was close. She reportedly told her ladies-in-waiting, "I am not sick, I feel no pain, yet I know I shall not live." Her refusal to sleep in bed became a strange ritual in her final days. She would sit on cushions on the floor, her back supported by pillows, and there she remained. Courtiers tried to persuade her to take to her bed, but she insisted the floor was where she would stay. On March 23rd, after days of watching her slowly waste away, her counsellors grew alarmed. They pressed her into a name of a successor, and Elizabeth had always avoided this issue during her reign, fearing that naming an heir would make her vulnerable. But now, at the edge of death, she could no longer avoid the question. The future of England depended on who would inherit the throne. Without an heir, civil war might erupt. Elizabeth's most likely successor was James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had been Elizabeth's cousin and rival, whom Elizabeth had reluctantly executed in 1587. Now, years later, her son was poised to inherit the English throne and unite the crowns of England and Scotland. When asked who would succeed her, Elizabeth could no longer speak clearly, but she made a gesture with her hand, forming a circle to indicate the letter O, which her counsellors interpreted as a sign for James of Scotland. Some accounts say she whispered the words, and others that she nodded in agreement. Either way, the message was clear. James would be king. By the evening of March 23rd, Elizabeth was gravely ill. Her body was weak, and she slipped in and out of consciousness. Courtiers kept vigil around her, whispering prayers and hoping for a peaceful passing. And on March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. The exact cause of her death is uncertain. Some historians believe she succumbed to pneumonia or blood poisoning from the white lead makeup she had used for decades. Others simply suggest that exhaustion of old age. What is certain is that she met her end quietly, without the dramatic scenes of some monarchs who witnessed her passing remarked on her dignity even in death.
Now, Elizabeth I had stipulated following her death she did not want to be embalmed in the method and tradition which was done for centuries. Normally, during the embalming process, the vital organs, such as the heart and other body parts, were removed, and this was done to preserve the body in a better way, so it could remain fresher for centuries. This has proven to have been successful, as some medieval English kings have had their coffins opened even 500 years after their deaths, and their skin and bodies have remained remarkably preserved, and even human-like. Some eyes inside of the sockets have still remained, as the body was also protected in a thick wax-coated shroud known as cerecloth. Elizabeth I had made it known to her doctors she did not want this. She did not want her body to be cut open, and she wanted to be buried whole, without any parts removed. Now, against her wishes, within hours of her death, the physicians inside of Richmond Palace got to work. They washed the Queen's corpse, and they then began to remove her vital organs. The body parts removed were her heart, her viscera, as in her intestines, her lungs, and other parts. The cuts made into her body were large, and inside of the cavity created as the organs were removed, the physicians washed and placed a number of materials inside to dry out her corpse. They would also have placed spices and fragrant-smelling materials into this cavity too. Her heart, after it was removed, was actually placed inside of a lead-lined box, and this was to be buried elsewhere. But throughout the centuries it has been found that it didn't go far, as it was actually buried in the same burial vault as Elizabeth's coffin. The point of this was to preserve her body for centuries after, but let's remember she did not want this to happen. But it was probably a good reason that it happened, and that her body was embalmed, and body parts were removed. It was probably Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's Secretary of State, who told the doctors to go ahead with the embalming, and he probably did not know what Elizabeth had said. After the body was prepared, it was placed inside of a coffin, a large wooden one that Elizabeth had constructed for her decades before. This coffin carried a Tudor rose and her name. She was left to lie in state inside of her privy chamber and was attended on by her maids of honour and ladies who held vigil around her body. The coffin was lead-lined to further protect the remains, and after lying in state for several days, the coffin lid was placed on the base, and then the procession to the funeral began. Earlier, I said that it was possibly a good thing that the Queen's wishes were ignored, and that is because upon the transport of her coffin to Westminster Abbey, something went very wrong. From inside of the coffin, attendants who remained close to it heard a very loud crack or a bang, which emanated from within the wooden box. What had happened is that there had been a build-up of gas inside of Elizabeth's corpse, and when the coffin processed on the cobbled streets of London, this gas then escaped from the body, and there was an explosion from within. The force of the explosion was so great it was said the body and head of the Queen broke open from the pressure, and people speculated that it would have been much worse if the body had not been opened and disemboweled after death. The force of the explosion was so great that it allegedly damaged the wood and lead of the coffin, and also the cerecloth she had been wrapped in. There may have even been some urgent repair work done to the coffin, but this is not known. When her coffin was buried to begin with, it was placed inside the royal vault of her grandfather and grandmother, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. It would later be moved to her own vault, which today is marked by a huge and grand lifelike tomb and effigy of the final Tudor Queen. This vault was later opened, and in the 19th century it was found the wood at the head of the coffin of Elizabeth had fallen in, and some of the sides were crumbling and had fallen away because of the decay. This would suggest there was an explosion and damage caused, and her coffin was actually placed directly above Mary I's, her half-sister, to symbolise her greatness over Mary, even in death. The death of Elizabeth I in March of 1603 was not sudden or violent, but it was slow and sorrowful. Surrounded by grief and weakened by age, she faced the end with quiet dignity. Her final act, acknowledging James as her heir, ensured that her death did not plunge the nation into chaos. Elizabeth's last days remind us that even the greatest rulers are mortal. After nearly 70 years of life and more than 4 decades of rule, she left behind a legacy that shaped England's identity for centuries. Her death closed the Tudor chapter of English history and opened the Stuart one, but her memory has never faded.
Barbara Radziwiłł was born in early December of 1520, and she had a very interesting life. Her father was the Voivode of Trachea and Vilnius, and her mother was also very high status. Little is known about her education, and it's assumed that she wasn't well educated. However, she could speak and write in Polish. She was noted for her beautiful looks and her charm, and she had a deep interest in fashion and cosmetics, often using makeup like most high-status women in the 16th century. She was offered to marry Stanislovas Kostauskas, a high-ranking member of the Lithuanian nobility, and a wedding treaty was drawn up. The pair married on the 18th of May 1537, with Barbara being around 16, and her dowry included many riches, including silver crockery, 24 horses, and clothes of satin and damask, decorated with gold and precious stones. Their marriage did not produce any children. However, after around 5 years, tragedy struck with Barbara's husband dying of a short illness. However, Barbara within 6 months began to have an affair with Sigismund Augustus, the future King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. It's assumed that the two began an affair in 1543. However, Sigismund was married to Elizabeth of Austria. They travelled to Vilnius, where Barbara resided with her mother in the June of 1544, but the following year, Sigismund's wife Elizabeth died from seizures. Following this, Prince of Poland and Barbara began to freely enjoy each other's company. Much rumours emerged at the royal court, as they would attend parties together and would go hunting. It was also believed that the prince created a secret tunnel joining his royal palace to Barbara's palace, so the couple could meet secretly. There were calls for the prince to marry another woman, and other women who were high status across Europe and the world to secure alliances. However, it was clear Sigismund and Barbara were in love, and they married in secret in the year 1547. Their wedding most probably occurred between the 26th of July and the 6th of August, and it's believed the wedding was kept secret, as Barbara may have been pregnant. However, she allegedly had a miscarriage, and later Sigismund Augustus informed his parents, the King and Queen of Poland, of the marriage. The news of the secret nuptials caused chaos, and he had married without the approval of the Senate, and many prominent members of the nobility regarded Barbara as nothing more than a lover. Many even accused her of being a witch, who used poison and spells to seduce Sigismund and trap him. But when Sigismund's father died, he assumed the throne of Poland, but there was much debate about whether Barbara should become queen or not, and there were calls for the king to abandon his wife. However, Sigismund stuck by Barbara. They entered Krakow, and Barbara lived a luxurious life. She was given large amounts of land and also royal residences, but she was not very interested in politics. Barbara's cousin and brother worked together to secure the family's power, and they tried to get Barbara to be recognised as the Queen of Poland. They worked with her husband the king to do this, and Sigismund insisted that she should become queen. Barbara was crowned Queen of Poland on the 7th of December 1550 in a controversial move. However, her reign would not be a long and prosperous one. Since she had married Sigismund, she was suffering with her health. She often complained of ill health which affected her stomach, and she spoke of internal stones, as in gallstones. However, following her condition, her health went downhill, and she had a fever, lost her appetite, and her stomach pain became much more severe. On her stomach a lump appeared, which became full of pus, and the King of Poland was intensely worried by this. He saw his new queen go downhill, and he asked women healers to tend to Barbara. However, although she did pick up, this was brief and did not last for long. As time went on though, things went downhill quickly. The king himself tended to his sick wife, and she allegedly stank of pus and suffered with fever, diarrhoea and nausea. On the 8th of May 1551 in Krakow, the expected came, and Barbara, the Queen of Poland, passed away in her bed. She asked to be buried in Vilnius, and her body was taken to the cathedral, and she was buried next to Sigismund's first wife. The king was devastated by her death, and he was distraught, and even walked a large amount of the journey to the cathedral on foot. Following her death, he wore black and avoided parties, and had a more serious outlook on life. The cause of Barbara's death has been disputed, as modern historians put it down to ovarian or cervical cancer, but at the time ambassadors gossiped about syphilis and sexually transmitted conditions. However, this wasn't the end of the story of Barbara, the Queen of Poland, as her remains emerged in the 20th century. Following a flood that greatly affected the structures of Vilnius Cathedral in 1931, the body and remains of Barbara were discovered. Now, during her final trip after her death from Krakow to Vilnius, her body had been covered in a substance to help preserve her remains during the long and hot summer days. Her body had been covered in a mix of ash and burnt lime, which helped to protect her remains. The wooden coffin she had been placed in had, over the 400 years, rotted away, but the lime hardened and formed a protective shell that preserved her bones and remained rather well. This shocked those who discovered her remains, and she was buried with regal ornaments, including a silver-gilded crown, silver sceptre, golden orb with a cross, and many pieces of jewellery given to her by her husband. These were remarkably preserved. However, during World War II, they disappeared. Now, during the Second World War, Vilnius itself was captured by the Nazis, who established 2 ghettos for the large Jewish population. As they were keen on stealing wealth and art, it's possible that some of Barbara's jewellery and artefacts may have been stolen and looted by the Nazis. When her skeleton was discovered, it was then subject to a number of checks and bizarre repairs. Her skeleton was cleaned and conserved, and also then glued together by professors at a nearby university. From this they worked out that she was 5'3", above average for a woman at the time, and that she had white and straight teeth, a slim body, and a narrow face. It was noted that she also had a number of strange abnormalities. She had an extra rib, and also signs of rickets, but her remains then had to be hidden away again because of the Second World War, and they were taken to a crypt under the chapel of St. Kashmir, and were not touched until 2001. More work on her remains continued, where her height was recalculated to 4'4", and then using her remains, experts reconstructed her facial features in an attempt to show what she would have looked like.
Catherine of Valois was the youngest daughter of the King Charles VI of France, and she was a French princess. When she was a teenager, negotiations took place to marry her to the future King Henry V. She travelled to England, and she would marry King Henry in 1420. But she was married to someone who was considered one of the strongest commanders of the 100 Years' War, and Henry V was embroiled in the conflicts between England and France that had been going on for some time. Henry V went to France to wage war, and he won the spectacular Battle of Agincourt, despite being outnumbered, and Catherine, who was said to have been a very attractive woman, captured the eye of Henry V. The pair married on the 2nd of June 1420 at Troyes Cathedral, and Catherine would then travel to England with her new husband, and she was crowned the Queen of England in Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of February 1421. Henry then, months later, went back to France to continue his war against the French, and he left even whilst Catherine was pregnant, and she gave birth to a son, the future King Henry VI. Her husband would never see the child, and he died on the 31st of August 1422, despite being just 35 years old. Catherine was 20, and she was left a widow and also a queen dowager. Her son became the new King of England, and English occupied France, despite being very young. But Catherine was seen as a catch to many people, especially nobles who thought they could marry her and then become a power behind the throne. The man who Catherine of Valois later married would be Owen Tudor, the man who would become the grandfather of the Tudor dynasty. The marriage of Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois was incredibly controversial at the time, and they went on to have at least 6 children. But on the 3rd of January 1437, Catherine of Valois died after giving birth in London, and it was claimed that she was buried in the Old Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. She may have known that her death was on the horizon, as she travelled to Bermondsey Abbey to seek a cure for an illness which was troubling her, and she also made a will 3 days before her death, indicating that she knew what was coming for her. After her death, her body was embalmed and her internal organs were removed to keep away decay, and the chest cavity was then filled with herbs and other spices, and her body was then wrapped in a thick wax-covered cerecloth to protect it. Sometimes these cerecloths would protect remains perfectly for hundreds of years. The plan, as mentioned, was to bury Catherine inside of Westminster Abbey, and following her funeral she was given a second service and ceremony, and was to be laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey near to her husband Henry V. But she was then dug up and disinterred. The tomb was only briefly a place for Catherine to be laid to rest, as her grandson Henry VII demolished the Old Lady Chapel where this tomb was, and Catherine was disinterred and dug up. And her body, which had been in the ground for around 50 or 60 years, had been decaying, but the coffin and the wooden box was said to have been in a bad way. Because of this, her body was removed from the coffin and was placed inside of a wooden chest, which was lined with lead from the old chapel roof. This chest was then just laid next to Henry V's tomb, and it was left here for around 300 years, and there were no plans then for a new tomb for her body. Henry VII may have left her remains out, as he wanted to distance himself from Catherine and the scandal around her marriage to Owen Tudor, his grandfather. He did want her to be buried alongside him one day, though, and it was claimed that in our monastery at Westminster rests our noble progenitors and blood, and specially the body of our great dame of right noble memory, Queen Catherine, wife to Henry V. Our body, therefore, to be buried within the same monastery, that is to say, in the chapel where our said great dame lay buried. Presumably, when Henry VII finished the Lady Chapel, he then wanted Catherine of Valois buried inside of here, where he one day would be laid to rest also. But Henry VII then would not carry out the building of a tomb, and he chose not to bury her, and following Tudor monarchs also did not do anything about Catherine's body. The chest she had been buried inside was in 2 pieces, and tourists and worshippers who travelled to Westminster Abbey would, for a small fee, be shown the remains of Queen Catherine when they asked. It became quite profitable for people inside of the abbey, and it was claimed that the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather, visitors to the abbey claimed that Catherine's body had bare skin and was naked with no clothes, alluding to the fact she had been buried naked, her body just wrapped in the cerecloth shroud. Some believed that Catherine was a woman who was being punished by her non-burial, and that her second marriage went against the wishes of a king, her deceased husband. One person who saw her body claimed that, sensible of her fault in disobeying her husband, it was her own desire and pleasure that her body should never be buried. If so, it is pity that woman, especially a queen, should have her will therein, whose dust doth preach a sermon of duty and mortality to all. People for centuries continued to see her body and remains, and the famous writer Samuel Pepys, who of course kept his famous diary, even kissed the remains and corpse of Queen Catherine of Valois, and he wrote, "On Shrove Tuesday, 1669, I went to the abbey, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of her body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen, and this my birthday, I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen. The shocking defilement continued, and further mistreatment in the 18th century claimed that her body was torn into pieces by a group of young students who messed with her corpse, and it was also said that her body became a shapeless mass of whitish colour because of the desecration. Her body was placed inside of a vault in 1788. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, this was opened, and people yet again opened Catherine's coffin to see if it was actually her body stored inside of the Villiers vault. The coffin had been placed on a pile of other coffins, and this box had yet again rotted and had stuck to the other coffins. Catherine's remains, once taken out of the vault, were analysed, and many pieces of her had been taken and gone missing. Some claimed that they had been covered in lime, but other parts had been taken. The front part of her skull had been taken, and one part of her skull was found lying, resting on her pelvis. A number of her backbones had gone, and one of her ribs, except one, had been taken. 2 of her right arm bones had been taken as well, and a clavier had been stolen, and a bone from her pelvis was placed in this position. It was a complete desecration, and her body had been pillaged. Catherine's legs were found wrapped perfectly and in perfect condition, and she was then placed inside of a new coffin ready for reburial during Queen Victoria's reign. It was then carried into Henry V's chapel to be interred. It was claimed during this procession that it'll be striking and an impressive scene, which I shall ever remember, and which at the time it was impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains and followed Mr. Poole, and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his hand one small lantern to light us, led the way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Scarfe and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, "We are attending the Queen's 3rd funeral." Not a word was said as we passed slowly round the ambulatory in the darkness. Her body, or what was left of it, was interred finally inside of a large and thick coffin made from English oak, and an inscription in this final burial place documented that her remains had been unburied for 400 years. It states on the tomb that it is the latest royal tomb in the abbey, and though long delayed, it has been thought that the singular and romantic history of a French princess and an English queen should be at length brought to an honourable end. Requiescat in pace. For the final time, Queen Catherine of Valois was interred and buried inside of a tomb where she will remain for the rest of time. But being brutally honest, there was little left of her to be placed inside of this tomb, which today can be very easy to miss. She was a Queen of England through marriage, and she was the mother of a king who would be deposed during the Wars of the Roses, but perhaps her greatest legacy is the fact that she was the grandmother of the Tudor dynasty and Henry VII.
In July of 1793, following the first anniversary of the declaration of the French Republic that deposed the French monarchy, the new government ordered a decree that caused chaos. They wanted to punish the former kings and queens who they regarded as tyrants, and they wanted to also wipe the monarchs off the face of the nation and also from the memory of people. With this, the National Convention ordered the desecration and destruction of ancient royal tombs. At the time, the majority of these were inside of the Basilia of St. Denis, close to Paris, which had become a royal mausoleum. With this, groups raided the church and they stole the coffins of the former kings and queens. Also stolen were the visceral urns of the former monarchs. These contained the hearts and entrails of them, which had been cut out of their bodies following their death. The crypts were opened and the remains were taken out of the chapel, and they were dumped in large trenches which had been dug up. The corpses were thrown into these pits, and then the revolutionaries threw quicklime solution onto the bodies to decay them and to then dissolve the corpses quicker. Later, in 1817, the briefly restored monarchy sought to return the remains to the Basilia, and they could only find the lower parts of 3 corpses and the fragments of 158 members of the royal family were later placed inside of ossuaries inside of the crypt. There was very little left of the former kings and queens of France, but inside of the churches there were further desecration as monuments were stolen and smashed, and there was a huge amount of damage. It was an attack on the old order which had been overthrown, and some who witnessed the exhumations and the desecration were even shocked by what they saw. It was a symbol to end the monarchy and an attempt to wipe those from history, and one man who witnessed the events claimed that God would annihilate an entire race and scattered its buried ancestors, and he believed that this was what had previously been warned about in the Bible. The exhumations had been little documented over the years. They were spoke about a lot at the time, and they were a rather important event. The exhumations were performed whilst many officials looked on, and whilst a large crowd made up of many people from the former monks of the chapel to the staunch revolutionaries looked on. The corpses were removed from the sarcophagi inside of the upper church and then taken from the coffins. There was a brief examination to see what state the remains were in, and it was claimed that the majority of the ancient dynastic monarchs' corpses had been reduced to ash, but the later kings and queens of France had been well preserved, but there were some who, despite the embalming process occurred, were in a bad way. The Bourbon monarchs were known for being in a state, and it was said that the putrefied bodies of some emitted a malodorous black vapour that sickened workers before it was checked with vinegar and burnt saltpetre. Inside of the central Bourbon crypt, one of the first coffins opened and broken into was that of King Henry IV. Under the light of torches, the corpses were lifted out of the coffin, and the remains were said to have been very well preserved. It was classed as a miracle, and a cast was taken of his face, showing the deceased king's face with his beard full, his eyes shut, and his face looking as if he died just days before. The corpse of Henry IV was then briefly inside of the choir before it was dumped into the trench outside. There was one corpse which was left alone, though. This was that of King Louis XIV, Supreme's commander, Henry de la Tour d'Avrigny. He was considered at the time the greatest general, and his coffin was opened as the crowd wanted to pay their respects to him. His body was said to have been odourless and intact, and a drawing was made of his body. It had been wrapped in a shroud, and this was uncovered, and it showed the brutal wound that he had died from, a cannonball being shot into his stomach. But the sight of his body stirred up some patriotism along the revolutionaries. There were a number of pieces of the remains of the former monarchs taken. People pulled teeth from the dead and then later tried to sell them. One man who saw the chaos claimed that I had the pleasure of touching these venerable remains. I took his hands with a certain respect that I could not resist, as true a republican as I am. He later saw a soldier who lifted up one of the corpses and then cut a lock off the red beard. Things became violent inside of the crypts because of the anger that the kings and queens represented at the time. A woman approached one of the corpses and swore at it, and then kicked it, which was so brutal that it was knocked from the plinth where it was placed. The coffin of Marie de Medici, the second wife of Henry IV, was opened, and some bones were found inside of muddy water or liquid, and 2 workers scooped them out, and then insults were thrown at her remains for the rest of the day. People pulled pieces of her hair from her skull and distributed them, and they then turned to the body of Anne of Austria. Her casket was opened, and they found her putrefied body, which was wrapped in a thick red cloth. This was then displayed.
Some people inside of the local area even began to collect royal voyagers' parts, and one man had taken a section of St. Louis's skull, the teeth of King Henry III, and the leg of Catherine de' Medici. 21 coffins had been broken into on the 16th of October 1793, and the remains were then thrown into a pit. One eyewitness claimed most of the bodies were decaying. A foul-smelling, thick black vapour was released, which they desperately tried to dispel with vinegar and powder that they had taken the precaution of burning, which did not prevent the workmen from feeling unwell and feverish, but without consequence. In total, 46 kings, 32 queens, and members of the royal family, totalling 170 people, had their tombs smashed open, coffins cracked open, and their bodies exhumed. All of them then had their bodies dumped unceremoniously inside of trenches outside of the church, and one trench was for the Valois and the other was for the Bourbons. A huge crowd gathered to witness the burial of the bodies, and the lime was poured into the grave to dissolve the remains quicker, but also to keep the smell down as the bodies stank. Later, the Basilica of St. Denis was reconsecrated, and as mentioned, the remains were attempted to be returned to the grave, but it was impossible to do this. The desecration of the royal tombs inside of France was a brutal and rough event, one which shocked and horrified many people, but also the corpses of a British king, James II, was targeted and his corpse was taken away and dealt with, despite him not being a French king. No nation on earth went to the extremes that the French did to destroy the bodies of the kings and queens that reigned over them. It was a harrowing event. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.